Americans, when you travel from state to state, do you feel culture shock, or do you feel like it's sort of the same culture, and why? I moved from Utah to Ohio. Let me tell you, moving from Utah to any state that doesn't border it is a culture shock in and of itself. The Mormon population drops from the overwhelming majority to almost non-existent. I've always gotten the impression Utah is the biggest culture shock in the country though. Definitely not culture shock, but it's definitely a different vibe going from some cities or regions to others. The biggest difference to me is just going from a rural area to a city, but I think that can be said in general. Look at New York. When you say New York to anyone in the world, they'll immediately think of New York City. But by far the majority of New York is rural countryside. My niece and nephew live up near Rochester, and we drove up from Pennsylvania once, and we drove for hours without seeing anything more than some farms and very small towns. I've lived in 6 states now, and crossed the country 4 times. Every once in a while you see more of a shocking situation, but it's rare. Like most have said, urban to rural is the big one. I went from Boston to a town of less than 1,000 in Alaska. That was a huge shock, but after settling in a bit you get used to things. Edit. Didn't expect quite this much attention from this comment. For real though, try to make it to Alaska. Are you still living in the small Alaskan town? If so, how's that like? I've never even stepped foot in a small town. Happy Cake Day, /carrot. Depends on how far you're going. Just heading one state over? Not too much of a difference. Heading all the way across the country? Definitely going to be some difference. The one exception in the Northeast is, if you stay too long, you start to realize that Rhode Island is just ducking weird. Not visible for the first week or 2, but then you really start to question things like what the purpose of coffee milk actually is. Not the same shock as when I visited India or New Zealand or Russia. No. There are certainly regional differences and things you will notice, but uniform enough to not be glaring or startling. I mean, I went from California to Nebraska. So much corn. Corn being grown. Corn being talked about. Corn and decor. Con. Where I'm from it's weed. So that was a weird change, but I think for someone who grew up in Children of the Corn Nebraska coming to weed country Wild West North California might be more of a shock lol. I'm from Florida, but like northern Florida near the capital. Something a lot of non-Floridians don't know is that in Florida, the further you go north is the further you go south. Basically the northern part is the most southern part and central and southern Florida are more big city metro vibes. People from different regions of the US always seem to be very fascinated with our accents. I went to Vegas for a few days and was asked where I was from several times. I personally don't have as strong of an accent as most people from my area because I went to speech class growing up, but it made me aware that even though subtle, I have a uniquely Floridian southern accent. Yes. Fellow Floridian here. I grew up in South Florida, like 45 minutes from the Keys. 90% of the radio stations are in Spanish, and where I lived and went to school it was like 20% white. I was used to being the minority and learning Spanish to survive. Then I went to school in Tallahassee, and I felt like I was dropped into backwoods deep south. So many white people, little to no Spanish music in clubs, and a lot of the people I went to school with thought the only 80% white people was diverse. That was a massive culture shock to me. In South Florida I was the clag white boy. In North Florida people thought I was Cuban or something because of the Spanish influence I grew up with. There's a culture difference between different regions, but the biggest culture difference in the US is between cities, suburbs, and rural areas. I grew up in a small town in Oregon and live in New York City, but if I drive 20 to 30 miles up I-87 the areas I see look a hell of a lot more like where I grew up than they do the city. There are some big differences between rural areas in Oregon. Waldport vs Yamhill vs Joseph will show some similarities. Only thing to do around there is drugs, but there are also some noticeable differences, primarily due to climate. I moved from California to Massachusetts. Definition: some culture shock attached to that. I did the opposite, and yes, it was my culture shock. Depends what state you're from. California is a complete bubble. Nothing like the other states. Hell, even if you go from a coastal city to a rural part of California, you'll notice a difference. There's a culture difference from city to city within the same state lol. Northern and Southern California also feel different. Even Southern California, I grew up behind the orange curtain, and it was completely different from LA County or San Diego. Then there is the Inland Empire, Aca Valley of the Dirt People, Acameth, capital of the state. We don't talk about Imperial County. I've lived in 5 states and have traveled to a lot. Huge culture shocks. I've lived in Utah, California, Texas, Idaho, and Washington. Huge changes in politics, religions, ways of life, rural vs urban. Washington is all about coffee, music, craft beer and hiking. California is well the glamour of Cali and the beach. Texas is very patriotic, but both California and Texas have a lot of Hispanic influences. Utah very small town feel, very friendly, but a lot of religious people. Idaho was very farm-y. Trucks, tractors, potatoes. Super small town. As a kid we just rode bikes around on roads that were 50 miles per hour. Running into a rattlesnake was no big deal. A lot of that is more urban vs rural than state to state. Eastern Washington, say somewhere in the Yakima Valley, fits in with what you said for Idaho a lot more than what you said for Washington. I say that as someone who's lived in both states. On the flip side, I live in Boise, Idaho, the only real urban place in the state, and your Washington description is closer than your Idaho one. What I'm saying is, you'll get a bigger culture shock by traveling from Seattle to Yakima in the same state than by traveling from Seattle to somewhere like Portland or San Francisco, out of state. Well, I live in a smallish town in Texas and I went to New York City a few years ago. It was very different. There was so much to do there, and the people there acted much differently too. You can get a culture shock inside of Texas. Beaumont native is going to stick out like a sore thumb in El Paso. Shoot, I experience culture shock within states. I experience culture shock within the same city. Lived in Maine my entire life and haven't traveled too much out of it, except when I was younger. So when I helped my sister-in-law and her 2 kids move out to San Diego area, where my brother was stationed in the Navy, it was a huge shock. Going from a completely whitewashed state to an area where we as white peoples were more the minority was honestly shocking at first. Like I had no issues with it. It was just kind of, oh yeah, there is diversity outside of New England. Lol, this reminds me of when my BF and I visited my family in NC and VAP. He's a born and bred Mainer. He'd been to Uganda before and expected how people there would look. But for some reason he could not get over the amount of diversity in my home state. He for some reason was not expecting too many black, Latino, and Asian people, even though I told him it was gonna be different. He was even more blown away by how different everyone looks, even though they may be the same race. Like when he met my family he was confused about how we all look different, even though we're all just a bunch of black folks. That resulted in some fun conversation about genetics. Depends on where you're going and how you get there. Going from any non-huge city to New York City, culture shock. Flying from anywhere to Hawaii, culture shock, although in the best way. Driving from say Illinois to Florida, not so much because driving eases a transition, but also because other than the ocean and some palm trees, it's really not that different. It's not like in Europe, where you can have a country next door that's wildly different from you in every way. Our cities mostly look and act similar. It's just little things like the attitude of the people, the weather, the plant life, the nature features, etc. There are a few exceptions like I mentioned, but I've never experienced true culture shock here other than New York City. I moved from Illinois to Florida via driving, and there was definitely a cultural difference. It might not be as stark as other places, but it was a noticeable and welcome change. I've lived on the West Coast and the East Coast, New England, and there are differences. It wasn't a shock, but it felt off. Then I visited the Midwest, Plain States, and it was like I was in a different country. The dialect, the prices, the conversations, the hospitality expectations, the bumper stickers were all different. No recycling and styrofoam was everywhere. I don't think I've seen a eating establishment give out styrofoam cups since the early 90s, but there they were. I've never lived outside the Midwest, and you just blew my mind. No styrofoam cups. I feel like it's more regional for me. I'm from Colorado, and Wyoming and Montana kinda have the same vibe along with most of the Rocky Mountain region. I definitely felt the most culture shock on the East Coast though. So yes, I feel some culture shock, but to me it's all regional and not state by state. I agree with this. I grew up in Southern Appalachia. NC, TN, VAP, SC all feel familiar in parts and more foreign in others. Now I live in the Northeast, and that was an adjustment too. Geography matters more than state line. My country is small, so I always wonder if Americans feel any different from state to state culturally or not, like I do traveling in general. Edit. Right, so this question popped into my head while watching a chick flick and dealing with a tea hangover, so I'm glad it's somewhat intriguing. Yes, but the rural to urban is a much more drastic shift in my opinion. Each state has some unique cultural tropes and characteristics. If we were dividing by cohesive cultures that you could overlay on large areas, I'd say West Coast is one culture, Southwest culture, Northwest culture is also distinct, Washington, Idaho, Oregon, and Montana. I'm sure the central states have a culture, but I'm not sure what it would be. Southern swampy states also have their own unique culture which bleeds into the Florida coastal culture. Then there's the East Coast culture and the many layers within that. East Coast is far less homogeneous than West Coast in my opinion. For instance, the northern East states have a unique culture compared to say New York, more similar to the Northwest, but with a heavy coastal overtone. America is basically the complete opposite of homogeneous. For instance, in Arizona you could be in PHX and enjoying a club scene similar to Venice Beach, but with western overtones, and in the low desert, and then drive 3 hours to Crown King and be in high altitude pine forest at an actual saloon, where people still settle disputes with a shotgun from time to time. I'm from Southern California, and I used to work at a hotel's front desk. Everywhere you look, the people with the most menial jobs are Hispanic older women and men. Housekeepers are overwhelmingly Hispanic ladies. The first time I went to New Orleans, it felt weird seeing a white lady ask me if I needed more towels. I'm Hispanic myself, and we definitely live in a bubble here. Southern California/LA is just a world unto itself. The scale of Los Angeles is hard for people to understand unless they fly over it or have a great view at night from a mountain. It just goes on and on for miles and miles of continuous urban area, not little towns separated by forest, like it is on the East Coast. For reference, this is a map of the urbanized parts of LA, and the outline is the entire state of Rhode Island, IMGA. As a South Carolinian who has lived in a lot of different states, here's what I noticed. They don't serve cold tea in December outside the South. And if you order iced tea from a place that actually has it, they probably won't serve it pre-sweetened. Weak cold bitter water is not refreshing, so I'll learn to drink plain water or maybe lemonade to get my sugar fix. I started drinking a lot more coffee for caffeine. Barbecue served in states not famous for their barbecue will be covered in sicky sweet ketchup. Don't order it unless you're at a highly recommended barbecue joint. The sketchier the better. Grits aren't standard breakfast food outside the South, let alone reconfigured for every meal, and most white Americans don't serve everything over either rice or grits. Manners are different in different regions. In some places, the rudest thing you can do is waste someone's time. In others, not acknowledging someone's existence is a height of tackiness. But people are just as willing to help you anywhere. Other people don't call shopping carts buggies, and some Yankees will fight you for calling all carbonated sugar water Coke. But only assholes will pretend not to understand that tennis shoes and sneakers are the same damn thing. Also, fixing to isn't a common way to say about to outside the South, and people will laugh at you for using it. They'll actually just laugh at / disparage your accent and dialect more generally. She crab soup and hop in John R to SC. What white barbecue sauce is to AL or coffee milk is to RE. A delicious but very local delicacy. Actually, I'm glad my mom taught me how to cook, because a lot of what I eat every day just isn't a thing in the rest of America, or it's made so differently as to not resemble what I'm used to. The biggest shock for me was discovering that black people really do make up a minority of the population in many parts of the country. It was kind of uncanny valley to be in a grocery store and not see as many black faces as white. I'm from the low country and moved to the Midlands. Whenever I travel outside of SC or the southeast, it is astonishing to not see that many black people. It feels oddly gentrified and divided. Here, everyone is pretty evenly represented in public. Just moved from northern CA to Nashville, Tennessee. Totally different world, dude. Damn that spicy fried chicken. I dream of it. There are some things that are the same that I think people who've never traveled don't think about. Street signage follows the same rules across states. Everything's in the same language, same currency, same general norms in basic interaction. What can be different is lingo, accent, types of restaurant chains or specialty food you'll find, norms and values in human interaction and relationship. That sort of thing that comes out in deeper conversations or staying longer in one place. I've lived in upper Midwest, Atlantic/South and West Coast, and haven't experienced culture shock. At least not the way I did moving to Eastern Europe and living in Western Europe. There was some adjustment though, just in jargon/language, rhythm of life. I found more difference in work life. East Coast has been accomplishment oriented yet more favorable to employees in work/life balance. Midwest was all about getting up early and hard work, and employers thought you should just be happy to have a job. West Coast was more chill in attitude and generous with benefits, but you're still working all night. I work in tech though, so mileage may vary. And work life is just a small example. Dead on about the Midwest work/life description. I was in DC and I'm from Massachusetts, and man, southern hospitality is real, even though it's not even that far south. Almost everyone from DC nowadays is a transplant from other states. Source, been here for 30 years. A few years ago I flew from Pittsburgh to Miami in the middle of winter. It was nearly 0 degrees outside when I got on the plane, and I was bundled up tight. When we landed in Florida it was like 80 degrees. Everyone was walking around in shorts and t-shirts. People were lounging on the beach in bikinis and swimming in the ocean. I had never been to Florida before and was not at all expecting such a difference. It was a huge juxtaposition to what I was experiencing just a few hours earlier. It's so disconcerting to step off a plane and suddenly it's summer. What's even more amazing is how quickly you get used to it and how that does not work the other way around when you go home. There isn't particularly strong culture lines based on the state lines. Culture varies a bit more once you look at larger areas though. I've lived in Ohio, Wisconsin, and Minnesota and haven't had any culture shock. My brother who moved to Los Angeles did though. Think someone in this thread said it best. There isn't necessarily cultural differences between states, but there can be between regions and between rural and urban. Sometimes there's actual culture shock within the same state. As a native of western Pennsylvania, traveling to eastern or even central PA entails a weird change in culture mostly centered around what food I can find readily available. Here in Pittsburgh, nobody's ever heard of birch beer, but over in Harrisburg, the stuff is everywhere. Same goes with things like Midlesworth potato chips, various restaurant chains, Hershey's ice cream, and supermarket chains that exist on the other half of the state, but don't exist here, like Wegmans, and vice versa, like Giant Eagle. It does give me a weird "isn't this the same state?" feeling, and I'm having a difficult time articulating why the two halves of the same state feel so distinct from one another, even though I live here. Then you have the whole Pennsylvania Dutch and Amish culture that simply stops existing on the western half of the state, but is absolutely everywhere to the east. How about the whole soda versus pop thing? If you were to check that old soda versus pop map, this state is divided right down the middle, with pop on the west and soda on the east. It's divided that way too for sports teams, Steelers/Penguins/Pirates to the west, Eagles/Flyers/Phillies to the east. It's divided that way for convenience stores, Sheetz on the west, War on the east, and too many other weird little things to list. Even dialects and accents vary wildly between the two halves of this state. Take your average Joe from Philadelphia and a Yinzer from Danton, Pittsburgh, and you'd think they were from two different countries. My theory about all of this is because there's a mountain range that divides our state in half, the Appalachians, and as they say, Pennsylvania feels like Pittsburgh on one end, Philadelphia on the other, and Alabama in between. Or Pennsylvania, as we call it, TL. Doctor, yes, there's culture shock between states, and sometimes within the same state. Pennsylvania is weird. The fact that you can drive an hour from America's 6th most populated city and be in communities that commute via horse and buggy always gets me. I've extensively traveled the country. Only place there was a culture shock at was Hawaii. Can confirm. Lived on the East Coast in CA, but moved to Hawaii 17 years ago, to a rural non-tourist area. The culture is different in so many ways. Population is diverse, but with Asians and Pacific Islanders and of course, native Hawaiians. Blacks and Hispanics are rare outside of the military bases. As a white person, I'm in the minority, which is still a weird feeling sometimes. The culture has been influenced by many other people transplanting here, such as Japanese. There's a good view of that on Padma Lakshmi's show Taste the Nation. There are certain spots that are just completely different from everywhere else, but for the most part, the culture shock is between urban/rural areas, which you will find even within a state. But it's not comparable to say, between countries in Europe. As a non-American, I'm sure it must feel different. England feels drastically different between London/S. East vs Merseyside vs Northeast, and the entire UK fits inside Texas multiple times over. That's 3, plus a third, countries combined, that equal the size of Czechs, Oregon. It'd be surprising if there weren't some noticeable differences even within states. Yes, but at the same time most Americans travel quite a bit and so the differences feel less pronounced and more expected. I know what I'm gonna get going to New York, or LA, or Seattle or Chicago. We're a huge country geographically, and aside from the east and west coast most of it is just absolutely empty space. I think the biggest differences are in the rural areas from place to place. Rural Mississippi is way different than rural Alabama, is way different than rural Louisiana, and they're all clumped together inside a few hundred square miles. Northern Minnesota is practically another country, Canada specifically, compared to the Twin Cities, and even Minneapolis is very different from St. Paul, and they are not even 10 miles, 16 kilometers, apart. I think these differences would be more pronounced to someone visiting from out of country than it would be for anyone who lives here and has traveled a bit. We are pretty consciously aware of the regional stereotypes and dialects. The episode of Top Gear, where they drove through Alabama, I'm pretty sure those boys were shocked. I don't think any American who watched that episode was, however. Utah though. Utah is basically Mars, and Mormons are basically like a cult of Martians. You get more of a shock going rural to metropolitan, and can do that without leaving a state. I grew up in a rural farming area, live in a small urban area now. There was some adjustments, but I got used to it. Going to Manhattan or Philadelphia is a huge change. It's a totally different experience. Just the sheer amount of people, which leads into traffic patterns, while trying to drive. I was raised and live in the Pacific Northwest. My wife is from the Midwest. Every time we visit her family it is a culture shock to me. Some aspects are good and bad, but it is weird to think that it is the same country. The passive-aggressive sarcasm of the Midwest got me. There's a lot of consistency in terms of stores, sports, restaurants, etc. I've never felt a culture shock. As a New Yorker, I certainly act like Jersey is a foreign entity. Being from Jersey, New York is its own world. I live in Seattle. All I have to do is drive east of the mountains to feel culture shock. Might as well be Alabama over there. Spokane native, can confirm. Besides the culture, the extreme in weather is shocking with the rain shadow effect. Desert to rainforest in like 90 minutes. I'm not from the United States, but my country is big too, and also have states. You can see small cultural changes and accent changes, but overall is everyone from the same country, so it is not like going to another nation. But yes, you can feel cultural differences. What country are you from? In general the only difference is shouting Jesus people in /inserts to hear /don't know how to drive. Beyond that minus small differences it's about the same. Except for California and Florida, they are different. Let me tell you. The drivers in Oklahoma make me feel like I'm going to have an aneurysm. I was so glad to move away from that crap. The biggest differences I see are yard decorations, regional fast food outlets, and convenience stores, and package stores, ice houses, or whatever. They all have local snacks and drinks like goo clusters, pulled pork in a crock pot, or big red soda. Store setup is usually different by state too. Picnic tables, and chairs, or nothing for eating outside. Oh, and lottery tickets that are cheesy, but in a different cheesy than your state. Not usually, but you can definitely see differences in people's attitudes. We moved from Illinois to the Boston area, and I was working as a restaurant manager. I would apply my typical Midwestern friendliness, but the people on the East Coast just didn't get it until they got used to it. I would walk through the dining room and ask if I can take people's trays out of their way for them, and people would straight up ask why I want their trash. Then we moved back to Illinois and now to Texas, and the people here are sometimes over the top friendly. Before COVID hit and we would go out to eat, it wasn't out of the question to have a table near you strike up a conversation with you. My brother and I were driving through middle of nowhere northern Louisiana on our way to Florida once, and we saw a prisoner chain gang. White guard on a horse with a shotgun, maybe 10 to 15 prisoners, all black, out in a field picking cotton. I asked my brother if we had accidentally traveled 150 years into the past. You'll probably pardon near Angola State Penitentiary. It used to be a plantation, but turned into a prison. So it basically stayed the same. It depends on how far out you go. Pennsylvania to New Jersey would have much less of a culture shock than probably going to Texas or California. But it also depends if you live in an urban or suburban area. This map appears to do a fairly good job at drawing the culture borders within the US. I can only speak for a small section, but 3, 9, 11, 17, and 19 seem pretty accurate. The only culture shock I ever really experience is when I go to buy beer/liquor and discover I'm on one of those wacky states with loony laws. Real examples I've seen that flabbergasted me at a grocery store. Oh, you're buying beer and food. You'll have to ring the beer up separately and take it out a different door. At a grocery store in a different state, you can't buy beer in grocery stores. At a brewery, we can't legally let you order a flight. You can order 2 tasters at a time as many times as you want. Would you like to pre-order your next round, and I'll drop it off as soon as you finish these? At a brewery, yes, we sell beer to go, but you can't take it out the front door. You have to go out the employee exit and back and keep it in a brown paper bag until you get to your car. At a restaurant/bar, oh, you want bar seating? That's over there behind that curtain. Trying to find a liquor store, oh, you have to go to a state-run store. But there are only 4 in the entire state and the closest one is 100 miles from here. You better hurry, they close at 6. At brewery, sorry, state law says you can't play games or watch TV while drinking craft beer. Considering that I live in a state where pretty much any type of business that wants to can sell alcohol, grocery stores, hardware stores, bookshops, clothing stores, etc. and you can buy however much you want, any day of the week, and pretty much any time, except the wee hours of the morning. Trying to find a good drink in some of those other states is a culture shock. I went to Maine once. Stephen King suddenly made sense. In Germany we have federal states, and I think the difference in culture here might be greater than the US vertical bar, where I have been on multiple occasions to different states. Please tell us more. When I travel from New York to states like Nevada and Arizona, it definitely feels different, and the way people are. Come to Miami and it's a whole different world. Actually, stay where you are for now. Lol. Depends on which state you're going to. Some states have a very distinct feel, like New Mexico or Louisiana, which have a pretty distinct cuisine and culture that you don't find in other states. I think it's also about urban/non-urban. I live near Chicago, and Indiana definitely feels different, but so does downstate Illinois. I would say much of downstate Illinois has more in common with Indiana or Iowa than it does with the Chicago area. I don't feel as much of a cultural change going to Milwaukee as I do going to Peoria, for example. Some observations from my travels. In the border towns in Texas, I have generally been greeted in Spanish at sit-down and fast food restaurants. English is the second language down there. Most everyone is brown/Hispanic. New York has some of the most attractive business class looking people I've seen, just very well put together and fit. What stands out about Alabama and other the southern states is how nicely dressed everyone is. The women wear nice floral sundresses and the men have nice haircuts and button-up shirts. There's an Alabama look that can be described as outdoorsy below the belt and dressed up above the belt. Blue jeans, cowboy boots, a button-up shirt and sweater vest with a ball cap. You can spot an Alabama man from a distance sporting this style. Wisconsiners are probably the friendliest bunch. They'd be most likely to make friends with a complete stranger and invite them to a barbecue. Southerners are the most polite, but keep you at a distance. You almost have to marry into the culture to feel like you're really one of them. Rhode Island has its own names for everyday things, but shares the Boston accent, which is hands down the best drinking at a bar accent. Seattle was so cloudy every time I've been there that it feels dark and surprisingly claustrophobic with the hills and trees. If you want some depressing entertainment, go to the McDonald's in downtown Seattle and watch the drug addicts. Best/brightest city I've ever been to is Charleston, South Carolina. That place is cool, great history, architecture, and food. I didn't when I used to live in California, but we're in Alaska now, and going back to California definitely feels like a culture shock. It's so busy and materialistic. It definitely takes me a few days to get sorted and readjust. As an old guy, it used to be a significant culture shock to travel between states. Today, not so much. Apart from the likes of New York City and San Francisco, everywhere is pretty much the same. What with the Gap, Starbucks, fast food places, etc. The interstate highway system also changed things up as you longer went through communities. If you go to the coastal states from the central states, it's a whole other country. If you go to extreme south from extreme north, it's very different, but for the most part, in the middle the accents change a bit, but we are all just people going about our normal lives. If I go from a city in the United States to a city on the other side of the country, the culture shock is not very large. Some accents, some changes in local eateries, some changes in the specific reason why the local drivers are literally the worst drivers in the country, but nothing that feels shocking. Now, if you go to a different city and then get in a car and drive an hour outside of town, there is culture shock. I feel much more out of place, in a way that I distinctly don't feel an hour outside of my own city. The funny thing is, when I return from a faraway rural area back to its nearby city, the differences that I already noticed in the city make more sense. There are differences between regions, but they are more muted in large cities. When I first moved to Texas for college from New Jersey, I visited a Whataburger. I mentioned it was my first time in Texas to the cashier, and he literally shook my hand and welcomed me to the state. People waved from across the street with their whole hands, and not just their middle fingers. It was beautiful. There is a great book I read about 2 months ago called American Nations by Colin Woodard. In this book, he makes the argument that American is made up of 11 different national cultures, and much of the unfolding of American history, quirks of American character, and the fractiousness of American politics can be explained by that fact. These nations took on characteristics of the first settlers, and those qualities have remained even to the present. He argues that there is no other modern, industrialized nation that has this much internal diversity / I would challenge him if he did not have the qualifiers modern and industrialized, because India is even more internally diverse. Each of its 28 states could be a separate country. The book made me reflect that there are larger regional differences between groups of states who do have fundamentally different ways of approaching certain questions and ways of being. I highly recommend the book if you find this sort of stuff interesting. Colin Woodard. I live in Virginia and my dad lives in California, so the first time I visited it was way different. Where I live everyone smiles at each other and says hi and stuff like that, and when I smiled I would get weird looks, and would get weird looks in general with him. Since he has red hair and blue eyes and I'm obviously biracial, you can only tell we're related if you actually look at our features. The traffic was absolutely awful, and the Walmarts had everything locked up depending on where you were shopping, and that isn't at all what it's like where I live. There's other things as well, but those are what come to mind. When I went to New York, when I was younger it wasn't too much of a culture shock. People were super nice. It was just very fast paced compared to where I lived, but other than those two places that's about it. It just depends on where you're from, and where you go. I'm not white, so for me, it's all about comfort levels as I walk around just living my life. Sometimes there's no reaction. Sometimes there's just a mild double take, or eyebrow arch. And occasionally some idiot will literally grab their children and move their whole family back several paces. But all three can happen in the same state. Most of America is fairly identical. You've got large city, surrounded by boring cookie cutter suburb, leading out to empty rural town with hicks. Most of the world is fairly identical. You've got one group of people, surrounded by another group of people that are somehow different in a handful of ways. Kind of both. I will always be surprised by differences in the way people talk, and food preferences and availability. Though I have found that slowly changing as people move around more, and a new place will definitely have a new vibe. But shock is a really dramatic word. I've never been anywhere that I was like, how is this still the US? Disclaimer, I have never been to the rural deep south. For some reason the phrase the deep south sounds so ominous to me, like a jungle/foreign biomedit. Extra words. Originally from NJ, live in far northern California, visited South Carolina a bunch, New Jersey duck you duck in duck, no left turns, pork roll. California surprisingly rural with some crunchy granola hippies, sprinkled with good old boy racism. South Carolina we are still mad about the Civil War. Each state is unique, but there's no major differences that would cause a traditional culture shock. Sometimes I get culture shock just by going to a different grocery store. Being from Texas, visiting Pasadena, California was a huge shock to me. They do not appreciate nor want anything to do with my southern hospitality. The same when I was in New York City. It was sad and had me feeling bad about my fellow man. I can't speak for CA, but in New York I don't think it's that nobody cares, but that it's so fast paced and we're always in a hurry to be somewhere. We come across abrupt sometimes if you're not used to that kind of directness. Oh my gosh, yes. Especially the food. I live in Cape Cod, now, and I was living in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania before. I would never get a cheesesteak here, just like I'd never buy a lobster roll in Philly. My country/culture depicts America as this amalgam of North and South with little distinction beyond political enmities and accents with nuances in modulation. It's not analogous to Europe or even Britain simply because your population density distributions and vast primordial nature. I think what entrenches this perception is your Civil War history that's propagated in a lot of TV shows and movies and your current tumultuous politics. Arizona might as well be an entirely different country to California. I've visited both these states for work, and there's a palpable difference in culture. Pennsylvania was another revelation on the diversity in America. After Southern hospitality and saccharine smiles are brusque, air to Philadelphians are quite sobering. I live in coastal Maine. Many tourists from all over the world in the US are shocked by how green everything is. Green as in there are trees everywhere. I never really understood that, because everywhere has trees. But since traveling around a bit I now understand why some people were so shocked. We don't have highways everywhere, only certain main streets are illuminated with street lights, while most other roads don't have any. The air is very clean compared to other states, and yes, there are way more ducking trees here than any other state I've been around casually. And I guess the seafood is nice lol. I'm in the dusty, brown flat part of Texas, and my wife is a New Englander. When we go visit her family, we always try to drive up and spend a few days in Portland or Kennebunk. Don't ever take the green and the water for granted. I live in Texas, but my whole life have visited family in upstate New York. I would say it is completely different, but not a huge shock. Everyone speaks their mind in New York, because people get less offended by what you say. They have a totally different accent. Less accent than most Texans. They don't know what having BBQ means. They just cook on the BBQ grill sometimes. This may be just where I was specifically, but once I was old enough to drink, the gas station workers seemed very judgmental when I bought a 6-pack. Coke is not a generic term for soda up there, they call it pop. There are a lot of differences, so I would say there might be culture shock. Most places in New York say soda, pop is a Buffalo/Rochester thing. Piling through? Not always, but there are subtle differences. For example, Ohioans love to drink, drive through liquor stores, then live in Indiana. Even walking out of a legitimate liquor store, you feel like you just walked out of a crack house and everyone is staring at you. Is drinking not that accepted there? Really depends on the states. NH to me, pretty much the same. NH to TX, may as well be another planet. So true. I moved from TX to NH and wow, I was like, why are people so angry here? I think the winters just make everyone miserable, haha. I was so used to men opening doors for women, and I one time ormed that a gentleman was going to open the door for me when he saw me carrying a large box. He didn't. He walked in and let the door close behind him. I was like, yep, definitely not in Texas anymore. But that's my fault for orming. My husband, born and raised in NH, came down here where we are at now, and he had a hard time getting used to people being so outwardly friendly. When they would tell him to have a blessed day, he was like, why do people keep blessing me? Is something going to happen to me? If you're a POC, then definitely. I feel it traveling through the city I live in, Seattle. Seattle, yep. It's uncomfortable here for us. When I was 4 years old, I cried inconsolably because we were taking a family trip to Rhode Island, and I thought I wouldn't speak the language there. To cheer me up, my dad taught me to speak with a New England accent, and then told me I was fluent. Moved from Chicago area to SE, Texas in 1981. Huge culture shock. Accents. Honky tonks. Frontage roads. Giving shoulder. Big hair. Gun racks. Made great friends. Still visit since moving away 34 years ago. I live in Texas, so there's definitely a culture shock in any direction. West is New Mexico with a beautiful blending of American Indian and Spanish vibe. A trip east leads to Louisiana and the French Canadian or Cajun ambience. South is the country of Mexico, which is also which is beautiful and amazing for so many reasons. But north to Oklahoma is the biggest culture shock of all, because it's like going back in time to American in the 1950s. Yep, I'm from the Northeast. I lived in Chicago for a little while, which was quite similar. Going to the South, however, is a culture shock. Everyone is incredibly outgoing and friendly. It's off-putting, because if someone does that in the Northeast, it comes off as fake. Also, there are fast food restaurants every 10 feet. West Coast is quite different as well. Everyone is very laid back. In the Northeast, everyone is career focused and much more uptight. I feel like UK culture is closest to Northeast culture. Obviously, these are all huge generalizations. I live in Co, and there are so many people who move here from around the country. We have a booming tech industry in my area specifically, that when I visited Boston last year, it didn't really feel that different to me. Folks say that people here are super friendly, but when I visited Boston, I didn't think people were rude, just efficient with their time and commuting. That and the slightly older history were the biggest differences. In Co, something from the mid-late 1800s is really old. Going to Boston and seeing stuff that dates to the late 1700s and earlier was super cool. Not the same as when I visited Rome and saw things that were thousands of years old, but still different from home. Yes, I've lived in Oregon all my life and don't travel much outside of it. I went to Idaho to visit my grandfather a few years back, and apparently they were having state elections, and I watched a commercial of a man saying how he was anti-LGBT and would put a stop to gay marriage. This really shook me considering it had been legal for years at this point and just generally made me feel less safe being there as a queer person. Oregon has its share of conservatives, but most of them have accepted the gay thing, so it was really strange to see on TV where that was one of his selling points. I agree with people saying one state over isn't much change as you move through regions of the country. However, there are vast differences. Climates change, geographical features change, economies change, as well as the people and cultures. I don't even have to travel from state to state. I live in Northwest Indiana. I travel a couple cities over and be in a low-income city, primarily black culture. Or I can go south and be in a middle-class area, primarily white, almost Bible Belt-like area. I can also go 45 minutes and be in Chicago. But if I went 45 minutes the opposite direction, I would see a lot of people that would call themselves hillbillies. Absolutely. The states are drastically different in terms of climate, geography, accents, etc. Alaska and Hawaii are completely unlike any of the continental states. Yeah, there are some pretty crazy accents out there. Absolutely. A short list of culture shocks I get when I leave, not just my state, but even just my heavily liberal/secular city bubble. Obesity. Obesity everywhere. Politics and religion. Just stunned when a family brunch has they need, do something about that mosque. Those Muslim kids just hate America. Verbatim quote, lobbed in there casually and nobody blinks. Tempo. Only New York City seems equal/faster paced. Everywhere else is just slow. Flat. So many other states are incredibly flat. And everything is far away. Driving long distances is completely normalized. Different subcultures, scenes, race/ethnicities. Not even talking about major demographic swings like black culture in the South or Vietnamese communities in Iowa, but even in areas that on the surface seem like uniform Midwestern rural white, the subtleties of whether 100 to 150 years ago it was scores of Scandinavians or gaggles of Greeks who emigrated there are noticeable. It's nothing as dramatic as flying halfway around the world and immersing yourself in a completely different culture, but are other states/regions noticeably different? Absolutely. Edit. Huh. Some folks don't like criticism, but there really are major cultural differences by state that can be, well, shocking to someone from a different state. Here are some maps. Obesity by state. CDC per capita anti-Muslim incidents by state. New America walking speed correlates with urban population. NAS topographic map of the US. NASA vehicle miles and trips by state. BTS most common languages spoken in the US after English and Spanish. Business insider. These are pretty amazing differences in culture between states. You can have culture shock going from southern Texas to the Texas Panhandle. Hell, East Texas is like going to Mars as compared to the rest of Texas. American culture is better defined by regions and subregions and states. Oh my, you watched until the end? That's fucking awesome, dude. Thanks for watching.